The Roman consul was like Rome's chief executive. It was kind of like a king, and kind of like a president, and even a prime minister in a way, but all rolled into one. They were unquestionably at the top of Rome's political hierarchy. The Senate was basically run by a group of ex-consuls. Roman consuls had, broadly speaking, 6 areas of responsibility. I will outline each of these in turn. The first, and I would say their most important, was their legislative agenda. Consular elections were held a full 6 months before the person ever took office. This meant that incoming consuls arrived well prepared and had a clear mandate with a full legislative agenda ready to go. Remember that consuls could call the Senate to meet and set the agenda for that meeting. This meant that they had the ability to propose laws and open debate, even if the Senate was dragging its heels. Also, they had the power to call the public assembly to meet, which was the rubber stamp necessary to pass a bill into law. But of course, there were 2 consuls elected every year. In practice, in order for the state to function, the 2 consuls alternated on a monthly basis which one of them was in charge. This just meant that one consul would kind of step out of the way and the other one would be allowed to pursue their agenda. They held a veto over each other, which meant that they could halt any action that they found offensive, but they both knew that this was kind of a mutually assured destruction situation. They were just better off to let the other one have their way and wait for their month in power to roll around again. They called being in power holding fasces. Fasces were the ceremonial sticks held by Roman honor guards, which were called lictors. I haven't really talked about lictors before, but most elected Roman officials had some. Consuls had the most at 12 each. Holding fasces meant that you held power. The other consul would not get in your way unless you did something ideologically offensive. The consul that got the most votes when they were elected held fasces first, and then they alternated for every month after that. It was kind of a prestigious thing to hold fasces first. People knew what it meant. Julius Caesar provides us with a pretty colorful example of why it's so important to hold fasces. He was elected consul alongside his old pal Bibulus, with whom he had served as aedile. Caesar and Bibulus hated each other. Bibulus was a conservative, backed by Cato, who thought that Caesar was a rabble-rouser, a dandy, and a showboat. Caesar, well, he was those things, and he really didn't appreciate somebody saying so. Caesar got the most votes, so he held fasces in January. He was hellbent on getting his signature land reform bill into the Senate on like the 1st or 2nd of the month, because bills apparently needed 24 days of debate before they could be voted into law. Caesar needed his bill to sail through the Senate. The bill called for the election of some people to oversee a massive land transfer scheme, which would give public land to military veterans and the urban poor. It was popular, and of course Bibulus hated it. If Caesar held fasces during these elections, that meant that he got to oversee them, and he could put his lieutenants on that commission. If it happened in February, Bibulus would oversee it. He would get his men elected, and he could potentially kill the law from the inside. This was, by the way, the second area of responsibility for consuls. They oversaw elections. For small-scale stuff like the election of land commissioners, or for big stuff like the election of next year's consuls, the sitting consuls ran the show. If there was any intimidation or bribery or mob protests or political horse trading going on during the voting, it was under the noses of the sitting consuls. If they wanted to, they could do a lot to make sure that their supporters were elected for next year. It could even be the part of backroom deals. You support me on this bill, and I'll make sure you win your election for praetor. Now, the third area where the consuls wielded a lot of power, which I've already touched on, was the veto. Only the other consul, or a tribune of the plebs, could veto a sitting consul. However, don't forget that a consul could veto any position. He could also veto someone else's decision to call the Senate to meet. This was an immense power. He could single-handedly shut down debate. Broadly speaking, like I said, both consuls realized that this was a mutually assured destruction kind of situation, so they would resist just vetoing each other willy-nilly. They had the alternating monthly system of fasces developed, which gave each other a little bit of breathing room. During Caesar's consulship, though, Bibulus kind of ignored this practice. Caesar's land reform bill sailed through the Senate as anticipated, but Bibulus vetoed it as it was going before the public assembly for a final vote. This was pretty rude. It was widely popular, and Caesar still held fasces. Apparently, as Bibulus vetoed it from a speaking platform before the bill was to be read before the public assembly, the crowd went crazy. They screamed wildly, drowning out what Bibulus had to say. They surged forward, reaching the speaking platform and the consul and pushing him off of it. We're told that the angry mob dumped manure on Bibulus's head, Biff Tannen style. Many people were injured during this incident, but nobody seriously. Even though Bibulus had vetoed the bill, Caesar got up and claimed that the crowd was too loud and that he hadn't heard him. Caesar then put forward the bill, and it was approved by the public assembly. After this incident, Bibulus retreated to his home and did not speak publicly again for the remainder of his consulship. To be clear, this was illegal on Caesar's part. Bibulus did have the right to veto him, and he did, and Caesar just ignored him. That wasn't the last time that happened, though. These next two areas of responsibility both factored into this. Consuls were responsible for reading omens and assigning public holidays. This may seem minor, but it plays significantly into the Bibulus story. Consuls were given the authority to set the date for public festivals and holidays that did not necessarily have to be on a certain day every year. Sometimes the Senate voted in favor of honoring a certain individual and just let the consuls set the day, for example. Bibulus took all of his festival days and scheduled them for days when Caesar had big votes in the Senate. Obviously, this was extremely annoying because Bibulus still wasn't leaving his house. Just like when Bibulus tried to veto him, Caesar just ignored him, and people generally went along with this. Consuls were kind of like part-time augurs as well. See, the Romans were highly superstitious, and they forbade the Senate from meeting on unlucky days, which I won't really get into now. A consul could unilaterally read the signs and decide that the omens looked bad for this day, and cancel public business. But the Pontifex Maximus was responsible for determining which days were lucky and unlucky. Julius Caesar was the Pontifex Maximus, so when Bibulus issued edicts from his house saying that he saw the birds flying in a certain direction, Julius Caesar just said, "I'm the Pontifex Maximus, it's my job to know these things, and I say it's fine." Caesar basically outranked Bibulus religiously. Again, in a strict sense, this was illegal because Bibulus had the right to assign his days, but the public went along with it. And finally, the consuls were responsible for Rome's military. Although the Senate declared war and assigned them an army, they held ultimate command. The consuls decided how wars would be fought, and oftentimes assumed direct control over the armies. The consuls had a similar system to holding fasces, but instead of alternating on a monthly basis, they would alternate on a daily basis. In other words, if there were two consuls commanding one army, they would swap back and forth on a daily basis who held ultimate command. It was pretty rare for two consuls to be in the field at the same time, but this system didn't serve them that well. The most famous example is the most famous battle in Roman history, the Battle of Cannae. To oversimplify things, one consul wanted to wait and one wanted to attack. So the one who wanted to attack just waited until the next day and attacked. This turned out to be the worst defeat in Roman history. Consuls had kind of a looser, pseudo-military role within the city. When they weren't commanding armies, they were still responsible for public safety. The Senate had the power to grant consuls something called Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which you can translate as the final act or the final decree or something like that. This was basically martial law. This said that the consuls could take any action necessary to protect the republic. During Cicero's consulship, he had this power bestowed on him. A fellow senator who had lost 2 successive elections to be consul planned to have Cicero, his consular colleague, and the entire Senate assassinated on the same night. The plot was uncovered, and some of the would-be assassins were arrested. One of this senator's subordinates left the city to raise troops in Italy. And the Senate, seeing what was happening, gave Cicero the authority to do whatever was necessary to protect the Republic. Cicero sensed a wider conspiracy within the city. He didn't think that they had captured all of the assassins. Plus, there was a potential rebel army out there somewhere. So Cicero decided to publicly execute all of the prisoners without trial. If they had gone to trial, they would have lost, but Cicero didn't think he had any time. After this, support for the conspiracy kind of went away, and Cicero was declared a hero. Unfortunately, this kind of haunted Cicero for the rest of his life. People came after him years later, saying that he had murdered fellow citizens. Of course, he had the authority to do whatever he must to protect the Republic, but it didn't stop people from questioning his actions afterward. So generally speaking, those are the 6 areas where a consul could wield power. To be elected consul was the highest honor a Roman citizen could aspire for. Every consul knew that they would be celebrated by unborn generations. Oftentimes, young Romans could easily win lower-level elections by simply saying, "My father was a consul." Now, this is not the end of the cursus honorum. This is merely the most simplified version. For now, though, this is enough to get a handle on Rome's political life. If you're interested in helping decide what my videos are going to be about in the future, go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. For just $1, you can vote on future topics. The first round of voting is going to happen on June 1st, so there's plenty of time if you want to sign up. If not, I don't care. I'm just glad that people are watching. Thanks.